Humanism and Dialectic by Mihailo Markovic. Mihailo Markovic took part in the Yugoslav War of Liberation, 1941 to 1945, before starting his studies at the University of Belgrade, Yugoslavia. He took his PhD in philosophy, first at the University of Belgrade, then in London at the University College, where he studied under A.J. Ayer and wrote a thesis on the concept of logic. Since 1955, he has taught at the Serbian Academy of Sciences and Arts. He is presently the head of the Department of Philosophy and Sociology, and along with numerous other posts, edits the list of contemporary philosophy for Nolit, a publishing house in Belgrade. Among his several books are Formalism in Contemporary Logic, The Dialectical Theory of Meaning, and Logic. One of the most fundamental problems in contemporary philosophy, in my opinion, is how to make humanism a dialectical philosophy and dialectic a humanist method. By humanism, I mean a philosophy that tries to solve all philosophical problems in the perspective of man, that embraces not only anthropological problems, like human nature, alienation, freedom, etc., but also all other ontological, epistemological, and axiological problems. A humanist ontology is a philosophical theory of the objects of the human world, whose boundaries are constituted by all kinds of human activity, including sense perception, the construction of theories, mathematical operation with symbols, etc., as well as the physical operations of the human body. A humanist epistemology is a theory of human knowledge. Logic should not be reduced to the investigation of exact, purely formalized schemata of thinking, which propose a much more precise language than the one actually used in the empirical sciences and in ordinary life. A humanist logic would investigate, besides formal logic, the general conditions of validity of a way of thinking which is expressed in real human language and which operates with vague concepts and incomplete statements. A humanist axiology is a theory of concrete, historically given, and variable values, not of certain absolute transcendental ideals and norms. Such a humanist approach to philosophy demands a philosophical method which accepts the unity of subject and object and of theory and practice, which is historical without falling into historicism, synthetic in that it takes into account the results of previous analysis, critical rather than ideological, and objective without positivist blindness for human values and practical interests. The philosophical method that meets these requirements is the dialectical method developed and applied by Marx. Many followers of Marx have misinterpreted his method and construed it as a more or less closed methodology, a teaching, supported by a number of examples from special sciences, mainly the natural sciences. But for Marx, dialectic was primarily a weapon of social criticism, a means of explaining existing social reality that would immediately point the way to revolutionary action. This activist and revolutionary nature of dialectic needs to be revived and applied to the human problems of our time. Contemporary humanist philosophy is, in most cases, methodologically below the level of Marx. Contemporary humanist philosophy suffers from methodological eclecticism, from an abstract and unhistorical approach to the problems of man, and sometimes from the deliberate underestimation of the methodological questions. This situation is partly the result of a widespread revolt against Stalinist dogmatism, including the dogmatic form of dialectic found in the textbooks in dialectical materialism, in the Stalinist era, with their muddled categories, arbitrarily selected examples, and obvious propagandistic function. Such a caricature of dialectic must be replaced by a methodological re-examination of contemporary progressive humanist thought. Section 2. Marx's dialectic is inseparable from his humanism. In his economic and philosophic manuscripts, Marx noted that Hegel's dialectic, as expounded in Phenomenology of Mind, is essentially a criticism of society, albeit a, quote, concealed, unclear, and mystifying criticism, end quote. The mystification lies in the concept of all forms of human alienation: religion, wealth, state power, politics, law, civil life, as alienation from pure abstract thought, which implies that the suppression of alienation is only a supersession in thought. This is the negative moment of Hegel's dialectic. The positive moment is, quote, the insight expressed within alienation into the appropriation of objective being through the supersession of its alienation, end quote. And Marx adds, quote, it is the alienated insight into the real objectification of man, into the real appropriation of his objective being, by the destruction of the alienated character of the objective world, by the annulment of its alienated mode of existence. In the same way, atheism as the annulment of God is the emergence of theoretical humanism, and communism as the annulment of private property is the vindication of real human life as man's property, the emergence of practical humanism, end quote, Marx. What Marx discovered in Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind remained the essential feature of his method. Dialectic is primarily a method of criticism, not, however, a criticism of concepts, but a criticism of real social relationships, not a fictitious and mystifying, but a real and truly revolutionary criticism. Marx's main critique of previous forms of materialism was their lack of dialectic, and of an initial humanist position. According to Theses on Feuerbach, materialism has considered reality an object of contemplation, and has thus neglected the importance According to Theses on Feuerbach, materialism has considered reality an object of contemplation, and has thus neglected the importance of revolutionary, practical, and critical activity. That was a quote. I should restate it in the form of a quote. Neglected the importance of, quote, revolutionary, practical, and critical activity, end quote. The first thesis on Feuerbach. By such activity, man proves the truth of the results of his thinking. Second thesis, and changes the circumstances whose product he is, Third thesis. The essence of this change is that man is able to grasp the world and all of the world's contradictions, to criticize the world theoretically, and supersede the world practically by removing its essential contradictions. Fourth thesis. Philosophical criticism should not take as its object the human essence conceived as an abstract property of each individual. In order to be concrete, philosophical criticism must aim at the real human essence, which is the totality of social relationships. Sixth thesis. This is a pregnant sketch of both a method and a humanist program. Das Kapital is the realization of both. In the well-known postscript to the second edition of that work, Marx stated explicitly what he considered dialectic to be. Quote, "In its mystifying form, dialectic has become a German fashion because it appears to be able to glorify reality. In its rational form, it provokes the anger and horror of the bourgeoisie and its doctrinaire representatives because it is not satisfied with the positive understanding of the existing state of affairs. It also introduces an understanding of its negation, its necessary destruction, because it conceives every form in its movement and therefore in its transition, because it cannot bear to have anybody as a tutor, and because it is essentially critical and revolutionary." End quote. Marx. Section 3. After Marx, dialectic was interpreted mainly as an abstract doctrine of method, a set of ready-made formulae, which could be illustrated by an ever-increasing number of scientific results, and which was a sacrosanct and invariable part of ideology. Thus, Marxist dialectic started its alienated ideological life. It was inevitable. Once the labor movement became a vast organization, it had to secure a certain minimum ideological unity. It had to fix a Weltanschauung, which I think is German for worldview, which under given conditions might have been solely that of Marx. End of parentheses. It had to give to Marx's theoretical and methodological principles a complete and rigid form, which Marx himself would certainly not have subscribed to. Even if it had not been made one of the fundamental elements of ideology, Marx's dialectic, like every great theory, would sooner or later have become a subject of scientific investigation. Besides the transformation of dialectic into a methodology, which was conditioned both politically and scientifically, it was reasonable to expect the further development of dialectic as a concrete, alive method of looking critically at human reality. Such an expectation would have been in accordance with Marx's original conception. On the other hand, both reality and our knowledge of reality have changed during the 8 decades since Marx's death. Marx knew well that a method and a theory of a subject to which it is applicable are mutually dependent. Therefore, the application of a method is that method's self-development. The further development of dialectic has not been realized for several reasons. The first reason: dialectic has always been a favorite target for the attacks of bourgeois ideologues who have called dialectic unscientific, speculative, mystifying, etc. In Anti-Düring, Engels was already facing the central problem of whether scientific facts verify or falsify the laws of the dialectical process, which were discovered by Hegel and, quote, interpreted by Marx in a materialistic way, end quote, Engels. Thus, the question of the character of dialectic was posed one-sidedly, from the point of view of its defense and not of dialectic's self-development. The second reason the further development of dialectic has not been realized is that right-wing social democrats, headed by Bernstein, rejected, quote, the dialectical scaffolding, end quote, of Marxist theory for the same reason that the right-wing social democrats dismissed his theory of revolution and the ultimate goals of socialism as a, quote, residue of utopianism, end quote. An opportunistic attitude towards capitalist reality was irreconcilable with a method directed towards a radical transformation of that reality. The opportunists also found a way to make use of science, not, however, in order to defend dialectic, but to refute dialectic. The theory of evolution was used to prove that there are no jumps in history, that the concept of revolution is unscientific, and that the progress in society comes only from small modifications and legislative reform. How did the orthodox Marxists react to this? Instead of developing Marxist theory and method in new specific conditions, they called for loyalty to Marx. Reason 3 for the lack of the development of the dialectic. The first successful socialist revolutions were accomplished in relatively backward countries. Instead of bringing the question of human relationships into focus, these revolutions had to emphasize technology and rapid industrialization. Problems of coal and steel pushed back problems of man. That's a good quote. That's a good line right there. I'm going to repeat that. Problems of coal and steel pushed back problems of man. Communism was conceived of more as a wealthy society. Communism was conceived of more as a wealthy society and less a humane and democratic society, in which, quote, the free development of each individual is the condition for the free development of all, end quote, Communist Manifesto. The fourth reason the further development of the dialectic has not been realized is that for Marx and Engels, capturing political power was only, quote, the first step in the workers' revolution, end quote, Communist Manifesto. Stalinism reduced the concept of revolution to the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the creation of a socialist state. What should follow is the building of a new society. What role would a method, quote, which into the understanding of the existing state of affairs introduces an understanding of the existing state of affairs negation and its necessary destruction, end quote, play in the building up process? If revolution is the whole social epoch in which not only the institutions of the old society, but also the provisional forms of the newborn social order, for example, the class rule of the proletariat, will be successfully superseded, then such a concrete and critical method is needed to constantly direct revolutionary thought toward identifying the essential shortcomings of the given society, i.e. those whose annulment is necessary for further progressive movement. And I'm going to repeat that whole bit. If revolution is the whole social epoch in which not only the institutions of the old society but also the provisional forms of the newborn social order, for example, the class rule of the proletariat, will be successfully superseded, then such a concrete and critical method is needed to constantly direct revolutionary thought toward identifying the essential shortcomings of the given society, i.e., those whose annulment is necessary for further progressive movement. But in a society in which public criticism was not tolerated, a philosophical method implying such criticism could not have been tolerated either. In a society in which there are sacrosanct authorities, a method, quote, which does not bear anybody's tutorship, end quote, could not possibly survive. Bureaucracy needs apologies, not criticism. God, that's another good line. This guy's a good writer. Bureaucracy needs apologies, not criticism. Bureaucracy needs apologies, not criticism. Bureaucracy requires its philosophers to direct all their critical and revolutionary zeal toward the external capitalist enemy. In socialism, it is desirable to see growth in all its aspects, growth of material goods, of culture, growth of the unity of all social strata. But when everything negative is construed as only, quote, a remnant of bourgeois and petty bourgeois consciousness in the heads of people, end quote, I don't know who said that, it is impossible for any new contradiction to arise in the process of socialist development. To be sure, it has been customary to talk of dialectic as a guide to action. But this has meant little more than a subsequent rationalization of various past political conceptions and decisions. This is why Stalinism did not reject dialectic as a whole in the way Stalinism rejected its key principle, the negation of the negation. The use of dialectical phraseology created an illusion of continuity in method. Furthermore, such a formalized and degenerated dialectic was needed to prove that whatever existed in socialism was necessarily such as it was, i.e., that it was rational. Section 4. The humanist thought which has developed within the frames of Marxist philosophy and outside it during the past decade is to a great extent a revolt against Stalinism. This has given it a militant polemic character and has also set some of its limits. In order to break one authority, Stalin, another greater authority, Marx, is being used. A scholastic philosophy, for which a suitably selected quotation was considered a proof, is fought by the comments and explications of other, quote, better quotations. This is often very useful for practical purposes and even theoretically necessary to save the most valuable humanist elements of Marx's doctrine from the oblivion in which they have fallen at the hands of both his enemies and his successors. However, rethinking someone else's thoughts is a far cry from that concreteness for which a dialectician should strive. Further, in its reaction to Stalinist positivism, modern humanism sometimes takes an unscientific attitude. It was typical Stalinist dogmatism to misuse science and to look for a quasi-scientific form for Stalinist dogma's doctrines. The party line had to be presented as the result of a, quote, scientific examination of existing reality and an exact expression of social necessity. At the same time, the decisions of the party congresses and articles of the party functionaries were the starting point for the work of social scientists. The paradox was complete. On the one hand, there was a society in which all important decisions were said to follow from scientific insights into social necessity, which was so rational that no errors were possible. And on the other hand, there was the same society ruled by the arbitrary decisions of a few leaders, without social science in the proper sense, i.e., without objective and critical empirical examination of its structure, its centers of power, its inner tensions and conflicts, and the way of life, attitudes, and morals of its various social groups. However, the fact that science can be used for the justification of the existing social order in both capitalism and socialism does not mean that a humanist philosophy should eliminate science or that scientific results are irrelevant to philosophy. The fact that doctrines of determinism are sometimes used to rationalize the most irrational blunders and inhuman injustices does not mean that there are no general tendencies of social change and no necessary limits to various possibilities of historical action. A genuine supersession of all kinds of misuse of science would be a wide integration of scientific results within the framework of a humanist philosophy. There is certainly no other kind of knowledge so objective and reliable as that provided by science. Whatever has been, is, and will probably happen in the near future can best be known by using scientific methods. Only science can tell us the real possibilities of the future course of events and the approximate probabilities of various alternatives. But which one of these alternatives we choose to take depends upon our fundamental human needs, our conception of what kind of human life and society are good for man. Our values influence the procedure of our research, and even our conception of what scientific facts and laws are. To this extent, there is no pure science, no pure knowledge. On the other hand, if our choice of aims and values is to be realistic, it has to be based on knowledge. To decide rationally what man and society ought to be, we should have at our disposal the most reliable account possible of what they really are. This dialectic of fact and norm, knowledge and value, reality and ideal, science and philosophy, is often neglected in modern humanist thought. A particularly weak point in many contemporary humanist considerations is the treatment of the great theme of human freedom. We are often faced with a choice between two mutually exclusive theses. One, a vulgarization of Hegel's well-known formula, quote, freedom is the knowledge of necessity, end quote, Hegel, and two, a belief that freedom is absolute and indivisible. From a dialectical point of view, the dilemma is hardly tenable. It is easy to see that once necessity is conceived in a rigid way as the existence of a set of laws which are independent of human action and determine the outcome of social processes in a unique way, any talk of freedom within such a context is at best a verbal game. The opposite extreme leads to the same result. To talk about human freedom without any qualifications as an essential element of human ontological structure, or as a condition of authentic existence, etc., might make sense as poetry, or even have some practical value as an implicit criticism of a world in which there is still so much oppression and denial of elementary human rights, so many concealed forms of slavery. However, the cognitive value of most such, quote, odes to liberty is rather insignificant. Upon serious consideration, it becomes clear that freedom means something definite only under a set of conditions. A person is free while acting toward the realization of a certain goal if and only if, 1. There is nothing in his objective surroundings that compels him to act in a given way. 2. The goal is an objective possibility, i.e., a state of affairs which is not excluded by the existing social and physical law. The proper means have been selected for the realization of the given goal. The person in question knows the first 3 conditions. 5. His goal is a real value for him. That is, it corresponds to one of his genuine needs, and he is aware of it. 6. His needs are not merely a result of various external influences. He has accepted them after critical reflection as a part of his personality. An analysis of this kind, no matter how sketchy and incomplete, indicates the multiple relativity of the concept of freedom. The reality to which the concept refers is contingent upon a number of factors, both objective and subjective. In fact, an essential feature of dialectical thinking is the thesis that any term has a definite meaning only in relation to a whole system of ascertainable conditions. In a number of other issues, too, we are being offered humanist solutions, which represent only the opposite extreme to Stalinist dogmatism. Once it was customary among Marxists to not deny that it makes sense to speak of man in general. It was legitimate to speak only of a man who belongs to a definite class in a given historical epoch. Nowadays, many open-minded, younger Marxists discuss anthropological problems and, for good reason, assume the concept of man in general. However, the informative value of such discussions is not always discernible. The defect does not lie in the mere use of too abstract and too general concepts. Philosophy, as such, has no limits in this respect. The question is, how are the concepts used? How much empirical content is covered by the concepts? Hegel's distinction between abstract and concrete generality is pertinent here. Abstract refers to those general terms whose meaning is constituted solely by a few common features of the denoted object. Concrete refers to general terms that have a rich meaning, embracing not only common features but also many specific and even individual characteristics of the denoted objects. Increasing experience and knowledge leads to the enrichment of general concepts and to the transition from abstract to concrete. In the light of this dialectical demand for the maximum available concreteness, no humanist theory is satisfactory which operates with concepts such as human essence, human nature, generic being of man, alienation, etc., without bothering about sociological, psychological, and other relevant scientific data, and without taking into account specific conditions of human life in various contemporary societies. Good examples of one-sided humanist criticism are the treatment of such problems as the effect of rapid technological progress on human life, the role of planning in society, the importance of future social ends. Bureaucracy in socialist countries has been insisting on strict planning in all spheres of material production, even in education and culture. Bureaucracy in socialist countries has been placing so much emphasis on technological progress that Marx's original conception of human society has been reduced to the idea of an affluent society. This impoverished ideal has been pressed on masses of people as a goal for the future, which demands the most serious sacrifices in the present. This ideology is now rejected by many Marxist philosophers for excellent humanist reasons. Strict planning destroys all individual initiative and leaves the workers in the position of men ruled by a new social group. Fast technological progress is not a way to solve all social problems. In fact, while fighting material poverty and overcoming primitivism, it also contains certain forms of alienation and dehumanization similar to those in developed capitalist countries. Sacrifices to be made by one generation for the sake of following ones is not something that can be decided by rulers alone, especially if those rulers do not sacrifice anything themselves. However, some humanist philosophers have gone to the other extreme in their criticism. They have rejected not only strict bureaucratic planning, but any rational planning. In both social and individual life, they declare that genuine creative activity is free from any previous schemata to which our actions should conform. But this is not true even for artistic creation. The fact that a piece of music, a poem, or a ballet has a more or less rigid, previously determined form, fugue, sonnet, a well-known choreographic design, certainly does not decrease its creative value. In material production and other objective forms of social life, one of the greatest problems contemporary socialism faces is how to build a social system in which self-management will be combined with flexible planning by some central, truly democratic representative bodies. This may seem contradictory. That is why those who prefer a simple way of thinking and who are unhappy with one side of the contradiction between centralism and decentralism quickly jump to the other. However, the dialectical solution seems to lie in a transformation of both such that they can be reconciled and mutually adjusted. The experience of socialist countries in the last few decades indicates that there is no other way to secure both freedom and the initiative of individuals and small social groups on the one hand, and rationality of the system as a whole on the other. Certain humanists, critical of the existing cult of technology, have also revolted against technology in general without any qualifications. What they condemn is not primarily the manifold misuses of technology and technology's inhuman byproducts, but technology itself as a metaphysical entity, an ontological structure of the present-day human being. This one-sided, unrealistic attitude disregards the instrumental nature of technology and the plurality of different, even opposite functions it plays in modern society. It liberates man from natural forces, but under certain conditions makes him a slave of his own products. It tends to eliminate his material poverty, but sometimes increases his spiritual poverty. This one-sided unrealistic attitude disregards the instrumental nature of technology and the plurality of different, even opposite functions technology plays in modern society. Technology liberates man from natural forces, but under certain conditions makes man a slave of his own products. It tends to eliminate his material poverty, but sometimes increases his spiritual poverty. It creates both an abundance of material goods and an overwhelming urge for property and consumption. Technology makes possible cultural growth on an unprecedented mass scale, but often technology provides only cheap cultural substitutes. Instead of overemphasizing one or the other side of these contradictions, one should grasp the one side or the other of these contradictions' totality by all means under given specific conditions. For example, the attitude towards technology must be different in a highly industrialized and in a backward country. The practical point of the whole criticism should be a demand for a rational control of technological progress, for a practical annulment of its negative, inhuman consequences. In this way, technology would be placed where technology belongs, as an important means of human liberation and fulfillment, not as an end in itself. Some humanist philosophers often sound utopian when speaking about ends, which to a great extent is simply the consequence of their method, especially their anti-scientific attitude and their systematic preference for pure speculative vision over prediction based on objective knowledge. They tend to imagine future man is free from all contradictions, all forms of alienation, an easygoing creature who constantly loves, plays, and enjoys nature. However, the experience of those countries that have undergone successful social revolutions and made efforts to build a new world does not seem to confirm such an over-optimistic vision of the future. It is true that some of the crudest forms of human alienation have been more or less abolished, but some have survived, and new, unsuspected ones have appeared, especially in connection with the creation of new centers of enormous power, which are no longer based on economic wealth as in capitalism, but on unlimited political authority. The increasing power of state and political organizations in some socialist countries has brought to life new kinds of social contradictions on both the national and international level. New forms of political oppression introduced by bureaucracy, new ways of grabbing the surplus product, even without possessing the means of production, new tensions between rich and poor, new conflicts between nations and countries within the socialist camp, etc. There is no reason to think that however great the social progress, the foreseeable future will bring complete elimination of old forms of human deformation and degradation without introducing some new conflicts and contradictions. In each historic stage of such a world, a philosophy is needed which will constantly keep in focus the essential problems of human existence, constantly give a sense of direction, and help to realize the optimal possibilities of a free and rich human life in the given society. This philosophy must have a method of criticizing, not only of increasing positive knowledge, a method that will bring to light the main contradictions of the human condition in each epoch, especially those negative aspects that must be superseded by creative, practical action in order to make the next step in the realization of fundamental humanist ideals possible. Thus, humanist philosophy and dialectical method seem to presuppose each other.